Boldwood presents Be Kind, written by Emily Herbert and read by Tamsin Kennard. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Strictly Caroline. On the 20th of December 2014, the 12th series of Strictly Come Dancing reached its triumphant finale. A little-known television presenter named Caroline Flack had won. It was a massive triumph, catapulting her into quite another league and setting the scene for a glittering career which would make her a household name, afford her some of the most high-profile roles on television, and present her with opportunities afforded only to a few. Caroline was to go on to lead an extraordinarily glamorous life that will remain in the public memory. And although she already had a substantial amount of television experience before she took to the dance floor, to say nothing of a private life that had also attracted a certain amount of attention, it really was Strictly that started it all. Many felt it was her finest hour, and as she became the series winner, she had never looked better or happier. Paired up with the Russian, Latin and ballroom dancer, Pasha Kovalev, this had been by no means a foregone conclusion. Other contestants included Frankie Bridge from the Saturdays, Simon Webb from Blue, pop star Pixie Lott, and Jake Wood from EastEnders, who put in a pretty impressive salsa early on. Nor was Caroline an obvious hoofer. To begin with, at least, she came across as faltering and nervous, with a very shaky cha-cha-cha as her debut. But as the weeks progressed, a change seemed to come over Caroline, with her confidence and ability growing in equal counts. For a start, she was clearly enjoying herself, not always a given in these shows. Secondly, the public loved her. Beautiful, photogenic, and sporting a gorgeous array of costumes, Caroline began to show an increased ability, a sense of rhythm, and a screen presence that, while it had always been present in her television work, was increasing by the day. There was a nail-biting moment when she once finished in the bottom two, but Caroline rallied like the pro she was. A rumba, a quick-step, and a paso doble all impressed, followed by a jive in Blackpool that really knocked the crowds for six. In an unashamedly high-spirited performance, the couple danced to Elton John's Crocodile Rock, Caroline dressed in a Union Jack dress, and Pasha as a Buckingham Palace guard, complete with distinctive hat. They scored 37 points that night, to the delight of the crowd. Judge Bruno Tognoli gave her a 10. Head judge Len Goodman, giving her 9, said, "If you were in the dance-off this week, I'm going to run to the end of the pier and dive off naked." He didn't. "You can't half-flick, Flack." There was also a 9 from Darcy Bussell and another from Craig Revel Horwood, who commented, "I thought you executed that with military precision." Judy Murray was the contestant to leave that week. Indeed, the audience loved the performance. Caroline's dress was reminiscent of the famous appearance made by Spice Girl Geri Halliwell at the 1997 Brit Awards, clad in a Union Jack miniskirt that she later confessed she'd made from a tea towel and which went on to achieve iconic status. And it was that image that Caroline put on Instagram the year after Strictly, when reminiscing about her time on the sequin-heavy show. "I just loved it," she later told You magazine. "I loved pretending I was a dancer every day, going to rehearsals in my leg warmers with my coffee in my hand. That was the bit I loved most. The performance days were terrible and nerve-wracking, to be honest." Not that it showed. Caroline was getting so good that there was even speculation about a future role in a musical on the West End stage. And, despite catching her dress in her heel a couple of times, her confidence continued to grow, culminating in a salsa in the semi-final that produced the top possible score of 40. "She bangs! She bangs!" screeched Bruno. "You're a supercharged engine fueled by sex appeal." That was followed by another 2 scores of 40 in the final, a cha-cha-cha to Can You Feel It by the Jacksons, and a show dance to Angels by Beverly Knight. As if that were not enough, there was yet another 40 for a Charleston dance to Istanbul, Not Constantinople, originally written by Nat Simon and Jimmy Kennedy. making Caroline the first celebrity contestant to score the maximum 40 from the judges in all 3 of her dances in the final, and setting the record for the longest consecutive run of 40 marks. And what really came through was how much she clearly enjoyed herself on the show. "You don't feel bad when you're dancing," she once said. "You can't feel unhappy, it's impossible. It's such a natural way to release endorphins." It had been quite an experience. There had been 4 couples in the last show. Mark Wright and Karen Hauer were the first to go out in 4th place. Pop star Frankie Bridge and Kevin Clifton, and singer-songwriter Simon Webb and Christina Rihanoff were the other runners-up. "There were 4 Beatles, 3 Musketeers, 2 Ronnies, but only 1 winner on Strictly," chortled Len, over-egging it a little, perhaps, but it summed up the atmosphere that night. Something special had appeared on the screen. When she won, everyone involved sounded nigh on delirious. The cha-cha-cha to Can You Feel It had an overexcited Bruno shrieking, "My golden sex goddess!" Angels prompted the audience to spring to their feet, with Darcy exclaiming, "That was like watching a beautiful contemporary ballet for me, and you'd be in my company any day." High praise indeed, from a ballerina of her status. Caroline herself was euphoric. "This has been the best experience of my whole life, mostly because of Pasha, but also because of the other contestants," she said, in the wake of being named the winner. "I'm so lucky to get to know this incredible bunch of people." The series was considered a triumph, regularly beating The X Factor in the ratings and peaking at 11.4 million viewers during the final. It had been a life-changing episode. "I think all people who've been on Strictly like to talk to others who've been on the show and share their experience," she said afterwards. "And it's always exactly the same. You go through the same emotions. It never quite leaves you. It's always just here, somewhere. It's a real magical thing to have taken part in. It's not so much a job, it's more of an experience." Caroline also went on to call winning Strictly the biggest achievement of her life. But there was another element at play as well. It was the breakthrough that pushed her into the public's consciousness. She had a solid portfolio of television appearances and a couple of high-profile romances, including 2 Harrys, Styles and Windsor. But this took her into a different league, that of much-loved national treasure and household name. It was one of the reasons that both grief and disbelief greeted her death less than 6 years later. How could a beautiful and vivacious woman with so much going for her possibly have reached such depths of despair? But even at the time of her win, there were signs that not all was well. For a start, Caroline's personal life was in turmoil, and as she later revealed, she woke up the next day feeling desperately unhappy. "I couldn't get up and just couldn't pick myself up at all that next year," she later said. "I felt ridiculous, being so sad when I just won the biggest show on telly. However, I felt like I was being held together by a piece of string which could snap at any time." It is easy in the wake of a tragedy to say that people should have spotted sooner what Caroline was going through. Her arrest for the assault on her boyfriend, tennis player Lewis Burton, in December 2019, was the culmination of a tumultuous personal life. The threat of prosecution and losing, if possibly only temporarily, her position as the presenter of Love Island weighed far more heavily on her than anyone realised at the time. In retrospect, the fact that she was not allowed to be in touch with Lewis, who did not want the prosecution to go ahead, seems cruel, not least because it deprived her of the support of one of the people she was closest to at the time. But, as it was widely conceded, Caroline had had problems in the past, and, indeed, she never made any secret of her woes, openly talking about the use of antidepressants, and having, as so many women in the public eye do, to put up with violently unpleasant trolling on social media, especially in the wake of the arrest. But at the same time, she was an effervescent presence, a bundle of energy that the nation took to their hearts. It is not uncommon for an animated performer to hide personal pain, but after her death, and in an attempt to provide an explanation for the tragedy, the finger of blame pointed everywhere. Certainly the abuse she had to put up with on social media must have had a devastating effect on a fragile woman, and there were immediate and justified calls for social media platforms to exercise more control over what they allowed to remain on their sites. But the plain fact is that nobody could really have predicted what would have happened. The nation's grief, however, was of a different order from that usually experienced after a sudden and unexpected death. There was shock, of course, that a woman who seemed to have so much to live for could have reached such a state. But even more, there was the sense that a personal friend had passed away. Caroline Flack, or Flacky, as she was commonly known to many, was one of a generation of stars who charted their every move on social media. But she did so in a manner that was even more revealing than most. With 2.7 million followers on Instagram and over 3,800 posts, her life was charted in eye-watering detail. Innumerable posts charted her trips abroad, her attendance at awards ceremonies, her fashion stylists, her drinking pink champagne, and her love of dogs, alongside occasional references to mental health issues, and much, much more. Much of it was indisputably glamorous, featuring exotic locations, designer clothes, celebrity friends, and a fast-paced lifestyle. But it strangely both managed to give the illusion that her followers knew her well, while at the same time detracting from the truth. In the wake of her death, it was commented that she was the poster girl for a world of reality television stars and a life of social media, and this ultimately led to terrible problems. And that certainly had the ring of truth. Instagram was also the vehicle that was to provide an insight into her suffering in the wake of her death. Her devastated mother, Chris, released an unseen Instagram post to the family's local paper in Norwich that underlined the true state of her feelings, but which she had been advised not to post. For a lot of people, being arrested for common assault is an extreme way to have some sort of spiritual awakening. But for me, it's become the normal. I've been pressing the snooze button on many stresses in my life for my whole life. I've accepted shame and toxic opinions on my life for over 10 years, and yet told myself it's all part of my job, no complaining. The problem with brushing things under the carpet is they are still there, and one day someone is going to lift that carpet up, and all you are going to feel is shame and embarrassment. On the 12th of December 2019, I was arrested for common assault on my boyfriend. Within 24 hours, my whole world and future was swept from under my feet, and all the walls that I had taken so long to build around me collapsed. I am suddenly on a different kind of stage, and everyone is watching it happen. I have always taken responsibility for what happened that night, even on the night. But the truth is, it was an accident. I've been having some sort of emotional breakdown for a very long time, but I am not a domestic abuser. We had an argument and an accident happened. An accident. The blood that someone sold to a newspaper was my blood, and that was something very sad and very personal. The reason I am talking today is because my family can't take any more. I've lost my job, my home, my ability to speak, and the truth has been taken out of my hands and used as entertainment. I can't spend every day hidden away being told not to say or speak to anyone. I'm so sorry to my family for what I have brought upon them and for what my friends have had to go through. I'm not thinking about how I'm going to get my career back. I'm thinking about how I'm going to get mine and my family's life back. It was a way of giving Caroline a voice after her death, something her grieving family clearly wished to do. Carrie sent me this message at the end of January, but was told not to post it by advisors. But she so wanted to have her little voice heard, Chris said. So many untruths were out there, but this is how she felt, and my family and I would like people to read her own words. Carrie was surrounded by love and friends, but this was just too much for her. Her friends Molly, Lou, Sam, Liam and Simon need a very special mention, and lots of thanks for trying so hard to keep her safe. Jodie, her twin sister, was there her whole life for her, but this time nothing could take away the hurt of such injustice. As Carrie would say, in a nasty world, just be kind. It was describing how she was feeling and what she had gone through, no more than that. It was not blaming anyone or pointing any fingers. We want people to read it and want it to be shared through the EDP, Eastern Daily Press, who we really trust and always have done. Poor Jodie was the one who had to identify her sister, a dreadful task for anyone, but perhaps even more so for a twin who was still in a state of shock. Caroline's statement certainly provided an honest assessment of her state of mind, and there was unease at the fact that she had been advised not to release it. Despite a huge amount of publicity surrounding mental health issues in recent years, including some valuable work done by members of the royal family, it was telling that Caroline's advisers clearly felt that she would damage herself by admitting to her own fragility. Questions were also raised about the world in which she worked, and above all, Love Island itself. It was a shallow show, based entirely on manipulating the emotions of a group of absurdly attractive individuals, and there had been some much publicised tragedies on the back of it. Contestants had taken their own lives. To focus so entirely upon appearance, to create situations in which people were tempted to switch loyalties at the drop of a hat, and then to leave the contestants to cope with their own brand of celebrity in the outside world, was clearly too much for some. And while Caroline was obviously a presenter of the show rather than a contestant herself, that meant her celebrity was far greater than that of the other people who featured on Love Island, with far greater pressures and a need to keep up appearances that would have been too much for many to bear. But it was not Love Island that provided the tipping point. It was the night in which everything had got out of control. Despite intensive criticism from many quarters, the Crown Prosecution Service, CPS, decided to press ahead with the prosecution, and it seemed that it was what would be made public that was too much to bear. Caroline was afraid the jury would be shown police footage. Her biggest fear was that the body cam footage would be made public, said a friend. She realised that it was going to be shown in court if it came to court. She felt that from that moment her life would be ruined forever. I hear that the footage is quite distressing. People in a position to know said that it was the shame and embarrassment that had got to poor Caroline. She had been advised not to expose the true state of her mind on Instagram, but now she faced not being able to stop the release of footage she had no desire to see being made public. After she died, those who had been involved with Caroline over the years, both personally and professionally, reacted in shock. We are absolutely devastated by the tragic news that Caroline, a much-loved member of our Love Island family, has passed away, said Love Island narrator Ian Sterling. Caroline and me were together from the very start of Love Island, and her passion, warmth, and infectious enthusiasm were a crucial part of what made the show connect with millions of viewers. Like many of you, right now we're all just trying to come to terms with what's happened. My only hope is that we can all try to be kinder, always show love and listen to one another. Caroline, I want to thank you for all the fun times we had making our favourite show. Nor did Strictly forget its old friend. The entire Strictly Come Dancing family are heartbroken to hear this incredibly sad news, they said in a statement. Caroline had an infectious energy and passion for dance. She shone brightly in the Strictly ballroom every week and became an incredible champion. Words cannot express our sadness. She was simply one of a kind. We are sending love to all her friends and family during this difficult time. In the immediate aftermath of the tragedy, there was, of course, a backlash among many. Love Island came off air for a night, and there were calls from various quarters that it should be brought to a permanent end, not least from the parents of contestants who had also committed suicide after appearing on the show. It is impossible to say if there was a connection to Caroline, but in her absence, viewing figures had already fallen for the first time since the show was relaunched in 2014, with 1 million fewer tuning in. Her importance to the success of the show could not be overestimated. There were also calls for Caroline's Law to stop the media bullying celebrities, although how to define bullying and how far this should go, would publishing the hypocrisies of a politician also be banned, was impossible to define. The CPS was hauled over the coals, not least because Caroline's boyfriend, Lewis, the person she was charged with attacking, had not wanted the case to go ahead. There was a heated debate in many quarters. The CPS can press ahead with charges, even when the victim has withdrawn their complaint, in order to protect those who live with violent abusers and are too afraid of possible retribution to press their case. The decision can be taken out of their hands to help them. But did this really apply in this case? Many argued that common sense alone would have established that this was a one-off case involving a vulnerable woman in the public eye. Could not some degree of latitude have been observed? The CPS was clearly doing its duty, and it was not alone in coming under fire in the wake of the tragedy. Journalists were accused of having blood on their hands, an accusation that those who knew Caroline well strongly refuted, not least because, unlike many celebrities in her position, she enjoyed spending time with journalists. The coverage in the wake of the arrest had certainly been extensive, but it was sympathetic in parts. There were some ill-advised headlines, but no one had realised the depth of her suffering. Her ex-boyfriend Andrew Brady blamed her management company. Another ex, Danny Cipriani, said that she had called him in the hours before it happened, that it was ultimately embarrassment and shame that killed her, and that he was wrestling with his own mental health issues in the wake of her death. The Met referred itself to the police watchdog, the Independent Office for Police Conduct, although it emphasised that this was standard practice in a case of this type, and no individual had been suspended or was being held responsible. No one seemed exempt. There was yet more controversy on the back of the fact that Love Island had been running throughout the tragedy, while the contestants, this year based in South Africa for the first ever winter series, had been, as usual, isolated from the outside world, and were thus totally unaware of what had happened to the woman most closely associated with the show. They were only quietly informed of the tragedy off-screen, right at the end, which cast a certain shadow over proceedings. Paige Turley and Finley Tapp were crowned the winners, but the final show in the series was dedicated to Caroline, and a montage of her most memorable moments from 2015 to 2019 was shown. Laura Whitmore, a friend of Caroline, as well as being Ian Sterling's girlfriend, had been standing in for her in the course of the show, and, of course, was as shocked as everyone else. The Irish presenter, 34, had a difficult task to perform, required to be both an entertaining presenter as well as acknowledging the seriousness of the situation. The common consensus was that she pulled it off quite well. She was clearly emotional as she said, "The past week has been extremely difficult, coming to terms with the loss of our friend and colleague, Caroline. We're thinking of her family and everyone who knew her at this time. Caroline loved Love Island. She loved love, and that's why tonight's final is dedicated to her." The montage followed, showing Caroline at her shimmering best. "Are you ready for love?" she asked a group of contestants. Wide praise for Laura followed on Twitter, where else, as it was acknowledged she had made the best of a difficult time. There was a good deal of soul-searching in the wake of all this, from all segments of society, and Laura lashed out on Twitter at one paparazzo who had followed her and Ian at the airport in South Africa. Another ex of Caroline, pop star Harry Styles, performed at the Brits shortly after the death. Amid a change of outfits in the course of the evening, there was a small badge attached to his lapel which read, "Treat people with kindness." This was a message that was increasingly associated with Caroline under the phrase, "Be kind." It was his first public appearance since the news broke, and although he had not said anything, his mother, Anne Twist, tweeted, "Heartbreaking. #RIP Caroline Flack." He sang Falling from his album Fine Line. Many fans were near tears in what was widely considered to be a tribute to Caroline. Harry also wore a black ribbon during the Brits, held at London's O2 Arena, and he was not alone in paying tribute. Presenter Jack Whitehall sent his condolences to her friends and family, saying, "She was a kind and vibrant person with an infectious sense of fun. She will be sorely missed." A black and white photo of her appeared on the screen as the credits rolled. There was a palpable wish that someone could have done something, alongside a desire to ensure that Caroline would not be forgotten. Nor was she. Her image was everywhere that night. The truth is that there was no one person, organisation, or anything else that was really to blame. A set of circumstances that came together simply sent her over the edge. But the Caroline Flack that should be remembered is a very different one. A pint-sized star, fizzing with energy, ambition, and a popular presence on the television screen. Someone who created an atmosphere of warmth and liveliness around her. She was much loved. That is the Caroline who will be remembered, one who brought joy to the nation. This is her story, and the ending apart, it is a joyous one. Caroline achieved a huge amount, and she will be remembered for many decades for transforming herself from the girl next door into, well, the girl next door. But the neighbour was the whole nation, and the girl next door was the person men wanted to date and women wanted to be. Truly, the nation's sweetheart. And nothing changed that. Chapter 2. A Star is Born. It was the 9th of November, 1979. Great Britain had just been through the winter of discontent, with widespread strikes, including those by the Transport and General Workers' Union, now Unite, refuse collectors and gravediggers. An attempt by the governing Labour Party to cap public sector pay rises and keep soaring inflation under control. A freezing cold winter, a shambolic atmosphere at 10 Downing Street, and finally a vote of no confidence in the government, leading to the general election on the 3rd of May, 1979. No one knew it at the time, but it was to be a turning point in the nation's history, as the Conservative Party, led by Margaret Thatcher, was pitched into power and began 18 years of Tory rule, a time that would utterly transform Britain, turning it from the sick man of Europe into an economic powerhouse, brimming with confidence, opportunity, and pizzazz. Britain was to change completely in almost every conceivable way, and although the advent of reality television, social media, and near-instant stardom, the milieu in which Caroline was to spend most of her adult life was still decades away. There was change in the air. Ambition was no longer looked on as something to be ashamed of. There were opportunities in the pipeline that no one could previously have dreamed of, and there were chances for women to make a life that did not just revolve around marriage and children. Margaret Thatcher, who was both married and had children, was the living embodiment of that. She had made it to the highest position in the land. She was the leader of the country, and for her to do that showed that anything was possible for a truly determined woman. Caroline would follow a very different path, but she grew up knowing that hard work and putting the hours in paid off. Maggie had done it, and look what happened to her. And at the same time, the very nature of television was changing. In 1979, there were only 3 channels: BBC One, BBC Two, and ITV. And while it is often now thought of as the golden age of television, with families gathering round the screen to watch one programme together, and then talking about it to colleagues at work the next day, to modern eyes the era appears impossibly dated. Many people still watched in black and white, and the box in the corner from those days now looks like something that belongs in a museum. By 1990, when Mrs. Thatcher stepped down, televisions had become sleeker and more stations, including Channel 4 and Sky One, had started to appear. The medium, along with the bigger society beyond it, was changing. But in 1979, the dawn of a new era, all that was still to come. And so that was the backdrop into which Caroline Louise Flack was born that day, the 9th of November. The youngest of 4 children, who included her twin sister, Jodie. She had popped out 6 minutes before Caroline. Jodie was the sibling with whom, although they took very different paths, Caroline maintained a lifelong closeness and devotion of the type that perhaps only twins can understand. She was often asked about it, but how could she know what it was like to be a twin, Caroline later commented, when she had never known anything else? Initially, it was Jodie who was set to be called Caroline, but at the last minute their mother, Chris, decided that Caroline didn't suit her, and so the young star in the making got her name. Theirs was a conventional family setup. Caroline's father, Ian, was a sales representative for Coca-Cola. Her mother was Christine, née Callis, and the family, at the time the twins were born, lived in Enfield, North London. And although they moved out of the city when Caroline was still a baby, that geographical location began a lifelong love of Tottenham Hotspur. The Flacks had a slightly bigger family than was usual in the days of the nuclear setup, and it was to remain at the very core of Caroline's life. The oldest of the children was Elizabeth, then 10, and brother Paul, who was 8 when she and Jodie arrived. After her father landed a job in management, the family moved to Great Hockham in Thetford, Norfolk, which Caroline herself dubbed the middle of nowhere. It was a picture postcard village, centred round a village green, with a primary school and a pub. The family home stood in a 1970s cul-de-sac, surrounded by woods and trees. Caroline would talk about its isolation, and how the local children would speak of witches and the ghosts in abandoned local villages. Norfolk can be very remote, and this patch certainly fitted that description. She had a quiet, rural upbringing, a world away from the bright lights that would one day make up Caroline's world. The children would play in the village and the nearby countryside, Jodie and Caroline inseparable, not least as they were much younger than their older siblings. Outside, as the 1980s gathered pace, momentous global events unfurled. There was the Falklands War, the miners' strike, and the rise of the yuppie. The Soviet Union began to totter. The whole world began to change. Opportunities were opening up, and the previously hidebound structure of Britain was shifting. Caroline's father went on to run a clothing manufacturer, and her mother worked for a local newspaper. Yet, while everyone was doing well, Caroline later recalled a working-class childhood in which money was tight, at the beginning at least. On one occasion, she needed pink tights for ballet lessons, for example, but had to make do with white ones dyed pink with Ribena. That detail was telling. Dance, it seems, had been a feature of her life from the very earliest days. So, more problematically, was eczema. All little girls are aware of their appearance from a very young age, and Caroline, ironically for someone who was to grow into being a beauty, was very aware of hers. She was a mass of insecurities right from the start, and her skin condition no doubt contributed to that. But it would be very wrong to portray her childhood as an unhappy one. While there were downsides, there were huge positives, not least because she was brought up by parents who adored her and made the family the centre of all their lives. And she was fortunate enough to have loving siblings too. The closeness with her twin, Jodie, dates back to those early days. The two shared a bed until they were 4, and they were in the same class at school together. In her autobiography, Caroline would relate that having a twin meant she never felt alone and never experienced loneliness in those early years. Natural playmates, although not identical, the children were unaware of quite how much was shifting beyond the boundaries of their home, but it would come to affect them soon enough. Ian did well in his new career, and when Caroline and Jodie were 7, the family moved again, now to a bigger house in East Wretham, which Caroline said was even more remote than the home they had lived in before. About 6 miles away from Thetford and 25 miles from Norwich, the small community had St Ethelbert's Parish Church, set in the traditional Norfolk stone, a pub and an old RAF site that was used for British Army training. Nearby, the ruins of the 14th century Church of St Lawrence provided the local beauty spot, looking grand amongst the goings-on of the little Norfolk village. It may have been remote, but it was an ideal place to house a young family. We had a pond and a climbing frame, as well as the chickens and a rabbit called Boris because our big sister was in love with Boris Becker, Caroline recalled in her autobiography, Storm in a Sea Cup. Boris presumably lived in a hutch outside. The family couldn't have actual pets in the house because of Caroline's eczema. She also had to avoid foods such as nectarines, apples, and cherries, all of which could bring on an attack, the first of a surprisingly high number of problems Caroline had to deal with when she was very young. Many believe these issues contributed to her insecurities in later days. In many ways, however, it was a rural idyll, and although Caroline's sights were soon to be set on a larger stage, for now she was content to spend time taking walks in Thetford Forest with her father and sister, collecting tadpoles, as so many small children do, and making her own entertainment, as the family lived a long way out. They would listen to the radio and sing along, giving Caroline perhaps her first taste of the performing urge that would come to dominate her life. Television, still with limited choice, played a part, of course, but the children remained unaware of the seismic changes taking place in the wider world. Entertainment was changing, too. While there was still no reality television as such, there were talent shows. Admittedly, these were not new, but the idea of a television presenter becoming a big star in his or her own right was growing. And in March 1985, a soap opera launched in Australia called Neighbours. Still running to this day, it would be screened all over the world. It, too, would have an impact on Caroline, who went on as a young girl to idolise one of its stars. Caroline attended a small village primary school called Great Hockham, set between Thetford and Wotton, with 4 classes for children aged 3 to 11. It had a lot of involvement with the local community. She then went on to Wayland High School, Wotton, also the alma mater of cricketer Sean Bailey, which originally opened in 1926 and 50 years later became one of the only 6 schools in Norfolk to go comprehensive, another of the seismic changes to be seen in the UK during the 1970s. It is now an academy. Caroline enjoyed dancing lessons in the school and appeared in village pantomimes and plays, as well as joining the school's dance group, the Gug. Right from the start, it was clear where her interests lay. But as previously mentioned, even back then, there were signs of great insecurity, which stemmed from who knows what. Caroline and Jodie were not identical twins, and friends say that Caroline thought that Jodie was both prettier and cleverer. Her eczema made her hate her skin, and she so loathed her skinny legs that she would wear 5 pairs of tights to make them seem more substantial. But given the closeness between the 2 sisters, her sense that her sister was superior didn't involve sibling rivalry, but rather Caroline's good-heartedness in assuming someone else, in this case her twin sister, was bound to hold the upper hand. This tendency to put herself down persisted. She went on to develop a veneer, an outer confidence that did not reveal the inner trauma from which she was suffering. It went back to earliest childhood, and there were problematic episodes, of which more anon. She also thought that Jodie was the more talented.